Good evening and welcome to our session tonight entitled A New Lease on Real Estate. Please forgive the real estate pun, but we couldn't help ourselves. So this session is a discussion about the future of commercial and residential real estate in our beloved city of New York and beyond, with industry leader and alumnus of the undergraduate college, Joe Sitt. I'm Robert Whitelaw, Vice Dean at the NYU Stern School of Business, with the privilege and responsibility to lead the undergraduate college. I'm also a longtime member of the finance faculty at Stern, having been here for more than 29 years. I'm delighted to open the session tonight and will shortly introduce our speakers. But before I get to those introductions, I wanted to provide a few key updates about the real estate programs at NYU Stern. While Stern has a long-standing reputation as a leader in finance, we have worked hard to diversify our offerings and placements in recent years, both within the finance field and across other fields. We have already been successful in that in 2022 edition of US News and World Report's Best Business Schools, Stern ranks in the top 10 in 7 areas. But of course, we also want to maintain our traditional strengths as well. So I would note that of particular relevance for this session, we are ranked number 2 in real estate. And of particular importance to me as a member of the finance faculty, we are ranked number 3 in finance. In terms of our continuing commitment to real estate at Stern, we house the Center for Real Estate Finance Research that works closely with our undergraduate and graduate students to improve and expand course offerings and career services, and to offer informative programs with industry leaders throughout the year, including a recent interview series on the future of real estate amidst the continuing impacts of COVID-19. Stern has also created a real estate module learning series, hosting modules on such topics as opportunity zone development, ground leases, real estate data analytics, entrepreneurial development, real estate and technology, distressed debt investing, and real estate acquisition and financial modeling. In addition, Stern has active undergraduate and graduate real estate clubs with weekly workshops this spring on topics ranging from real estate development and acquisitions to real estate private equity and banking. At the undergraduate level specifically, our professional development and career education team employs a peer mentor in real estate each year among our team of student career mentors, a reflection of the high student interest in this area. In fact, this year, our real estate peer mentor completed more than 60 appointments with students. In terms of placement, our students have accepted real estate positions at both specialized real estate companies and companies in a variety of other sectors, such as Brookfield, Blackstone, Tishman Speyer, Related Group, Amazon, CBRE, Harrison Street, Compass, and Arch Companies, among others. And of course, many of our alumni hold impressive positions in real estate across the globe, including tonight's guest of honor. Thus, without further ado, I would like to introduce Joseph Sitt. Joe is a 1986 undergrad Stern alumnus and chairman of Thor Equities Group. I am sure you have seen signs for Thor Equities all over New York City. They are a global leader in urban real estate development and leasing and management of commercial, residential, retail, hotel, and mixed-use assets. We are absolutely delighted to extend a warm virtual welcome to you, Joe, and to have an opportunity to hear from you on the occasion of your 35th reunion. Joe will be interviewed by one of the recent graduates from our MBA program, Sid Prabhakar. Sid graduated in 2018 and served as co-president of the Real Estate Club while at Stern. Sid currently works as VP of Commercial Real Estate at TD Bank. Sid, I hand the floor over to you for what will undoubtedly be a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Dean Whitelaw. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with the alumni community today. We have a great conversation in store, but before we start, a couple housekeeping notes. We'll be speaking for about 40 minutes on various topics, after which we'll be fielding some questions from the audience. If you'd like to submit a question, please use the Q&A chat feature that you see on your screen. Also note, we'll be recording this session along with all other reunion sessions, and those recordings will be available within 2 to 3 weeks. So with that, let's get started. Joe, welcome, and thank you so much for your time today. So I wanted to start by just get a little bit to know about you. Can you tell us about your start in real estate, especially since your first real estate venture was actually while you were still a student here at NYU?
Thank you. If you don't mind, if you can repeat the last part, Sid, just because I missed part of your question.
Yeah, sure, no problem. I wanted to get a little bit to know about you and to know about your start in real estate. Particularly since your first real estate venture you actually started while you were still at NYU as a student.
Yes. Okay, will do. Well, one of the things that we first of all, good afternoon or good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for having me. I get to do this with NYU once every about 10 or 15 years. So I guess I can start dating myself by these interviews. First of all, I love NYU. I feel a strong bond. I feel a part of that NYU family. It never goes away. Even in my earliest years when I left, I worked with Professor Angel, for those of you who remember that name. And then afterwards with Dean Guilfoyle and Dean Susan Greenbaum, all of which I kept great relationships with, and fond memories of Professor Angel, who was always calling on his prior former students and now alumni come back and teach in class. He activated us as fundraisers for the school. We used to do a lot of dial-a-thons over many years, probably my first 10 years of graduating. I didn't realize how much more work I was going to do beyond the tuition we paid. But it was a great history. In terms of my history, I've always had the entrepreneurial spirit. In fact, one of the things that we spoke with Dean Whitelaw about was it was a little bit taboo to be so focused. It was considered a little bit too unintellectual to have too much entrepreneurial spirit. But it was a bug that bit me, and NYU was receptive to it. Even though it wasn't a traditional course there, the professors were very open to have sidebars, conversations, discussions, and always encouraging, not discouraging. In terms about my own personal start, was while I was attending NYU, I did my first real estate transaction. Back then, I was involved with buying a small vacant property on East Tremont Avenue in the Bronx to develop a retail building on. That was the vision. And then the second thing was a large industrial property in South New Jersey. New York was a different place back then. I'll never forget driving after class at NYU to go see the first property, or amongst those two first properties, the one in East Tremont Avenue, and turning to somebody who was with me. And I said, this is great property, et cetera, but why don't they clean the street? What's all that stuff they have written in the street? And they turned to me and said, that's chalk marks. After somebody gets shot, the police normally chalk out where the bodies were for research or follow-up investigation afterwards. So it was a scary first experience and a little bit of telling of how far New York has come since those very early days. But coming back, again, I thank NYU for the education and the entrepreneurial spirit that led me to do that, and then a few consumer product companies transactions, which I could talk about next if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. Was there something in particular that drew you to real estate as sort of an industry or a venture?
Yes, being a student of history, It was actually probably more so my history classes, particularly one on New York City back then, or a program that they had where they had lectures come in and talk about the history of New York. That excited me and motivated me. If you looked at New York City in terms of the infrastructure that it had in place and the history of what it had in place, and you looked at going back 150, 200 years, you saw these waves, almost like a stock market wave of successes and failures in terms of New York's environment. And back then, New York was beaten down. Crime was obviously up. And when I looked around, I saw an amazing city with so much potential, and started seeing some of those early signs of potential excitement, namely being a student on NYU's campus was Soho. Back then, all the streets were cobblestone. I miss those days, to be candid. Even though I like modernizing, et cetera, I really think that was a mistake. They should have left the cobblestone streets. But we started seeing the artist community coming into Soho, and started seeing the effects that it was having in Soho, and then some of the cooler early start restaurants that were coming in. And it was my first education on renewal within a community, gentrification, whatever the various words you want to come to describe it. But it was my first experience of watching a neighborhood, really blossom. And I think that each day that I was walking or driving through NYU, the Village in Soho, and watching it through my tenure there as a student was almost like I was living live in a petri dish of an urban renewal experience. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the inspiration. Years later, fast forward, when we were aggressively buying, we were one of the first pioneers in Wynwood, in Miami, in Fulton Market, in Chicago, downtown Brooklyn, Williamsburg, et cetera. A lot of the inspiration really came from what I saw and experienced there. And the same thing internationally. Our involvement with Shoreditch in London, Soho, London, Marais District, Paris, and other cool and hip and happening places. In fact, a little bit of a curveball, but years back when I was a student at NYU, what really taught me it was going out. It was going out to the restaurants and really being part of the late night. And I sort of used it as an excuse with my wife, Betty, to allow me to go club hopping in Wynwood and Fulton Market and whatnot. And I said, I'm doing research for our real estate business.
Yeah, that sounds like a great experience. Yeah. So you sort of alluded to your various times, various points in your career in real estate. So sort of what trends were you seeing in real estate before the pandemic? And do you see those trends continuing thereafter, or has the pandemic sort of disrupted the entire space?
Okay. First of all, just to say, going backwards, there was two ways I was involved entrepreneurially in my early 20s. One was the real estate zone. The other was the consumer products business. At a fairly young age, I think I was about 24 years old, I was the buyer of something called the Children's Play stores. And then soon after was the founder of a company called Ashley Stewart. And the vision for those businesses was, again, serving an underserved marketplace, meaning we saw the cities in America and the city right here in New York just being so underserved and missing so many of the basic needs. And so just to add, whether it was the real estate side or later on the consumer products businesses and the retail business, direct to consumer brand involvement, it was both of them to fill voids that we saw in the cities. In terms of the pandemic, we can talk a lot about that. Well, I'll say like this. First, it was, as I said often, and maybe you heard my interviews, but it was the great acceleration. I was on panels back in March and April, and every panel was was a different version of the word Great Financial Recession number 2, GFC2. And I always have to start off my speaking by saying it's such a misnomer. I'm not going to argue with the powers that be that decided to headline the conference GFC2 or the next recession, et cetera, but I would constantly say it's GA1, the Great Acceleration number 1. And what I meant by that was that what I would constantly say is that there would be winners and there would be losers as a result of the disruption that happened in the world. And my view of the world was that every trend that was already happening, unless it had a human-to-human touch point, was just going to get further accelerated at hyperspeed. So much revolved around things digital. And we saw it. The volume of business that happened in e-commerce, the volume of business that happened in the Netflix, the volume of business that happened in the Zoom. And my comment is that at the first stage, I said I saw opportunity in those things that I felt would be accelerated, where the baby was being thrown out with the bathwater. And that could be a property, real estate, or it could be in the same way, public market equities. You take 2 of the spaces we focus in on today, and we could talk about us and our strategies, but we're mostly focused on labs and logistics. If you looked at the public equity markets, we were buying up Prologis and we were buying Alexandria Realty. And everybody's like, why are you buying those? Because their stock prices are going this way, but their business has to be going that way. And the same thing in Amazon, the same thing in Zoom, et cetera, et cetera. And my comment was the next dimension will come in terms of great opportunity will be those things that were already very successful, but got severely damaged by the disruption of the pandemic. And those things relate to communality. It could be a Soho house. It could be music and event venues. It could be resort destination hotels. All of those things were trending so well until February of last year, and then they ground to a halt. And my comment and advice to everybody was, then if anybody missed, and this would be, let's say, my comments by about May as opposed to March, if anybody, or June, if anybody missed the great acceleration opportunity, part 1, I said there's a great acceleration part 2, or a great opportunity, which is opportunistic investments meets growth strategies, which is strategies like those that will do well as soon as a vaccine comes out. And then the last, which we'll talk about now, is what I've seen, which I've been talking about for the last few months, is the violent reopening, as I call it. First, let me say also that myself being so exposed to the biotech industry, both as an investor in the real estate space with so many tenants, as well as my experience in investing in biotech. I actually invest with a friend named Peter Cash, wrote lots of books, spoken at NYU years ago. I may have met him actually there. And you had 3 people, and they're all smart and amongst the wealthiest. So who might have criticized them, but I'll just comment. But you had Bill Gates, Sam Zell, and Warren Buffett, basically all 3 amongst the smartest people on the planet Earth. If you go back and watch their interviews in March, basically they were calling for the end of the world. And any panels that I was on in March or April, et cetera, the first thing they would do is quote from one of those 3 folks and talk about why the world's coming to an end. And as I said at the time, it wasn't fair because they had what I often call ownership bias. What I mean by that is that in the case of Bill Gates, he was always revolved around so much of the predicting of this pandemic to come, God bless him, and he called it right, but he got so caught up into it that I feel like he got blinded when he told the world that it would be a minimum of 3 years before we have a vaccine, if ever, and most likely never in our lifetimes is a vaccine going to come out for COVID. And and you had Sam Zell and Warren Buffett, both, again, absolute geniuses. Their ownership bias was really their age. Because their age, folks like them basically bunkered down to a much greater degree than any of us did. I guess I suffered and I benefited that I happened to have been traveling through Dubai and Saudi Arabia and France in late February, early March. So I was sort of like a ground zero patient here in the United States. And back then, I didn't have a sense of smell or taste, and all the doctors thought I was crazy. Just a blurb, because there was no way you could know what you had, and nobody had any experience of it. But having visited that and faced that monster, and then thank the Lord above, made it to the other side, I had a different perspective of Warren Buffett and Sam Zell, who, like I said, would constantly say the world's coming to an end. My view now is, now that the vaccine, 4 dimensions now make for my next disruption that I've been talking about since early January. One is that on January 6th, as I often joke, Schumer and Pelosi each got elected president. And now it's a triumvirate. You have President Biden, President Pelosi, President Schumer, and a little bit of President Harris. You don't have, a dictatorial type of presidency as you often have had in the past in the United States of America. And the biggest dynamic I felt of that was going to mean that the stimulus and government spending would happen and happen quickly, as opposed to McConnell, whose agenda was stopping so much of that spending. And when you have those these dynamics each come together the way they have, PPP, a vaccine, and literally spring weather here in the United States of America, I say it's a formula for a violent reopening. And whereas I was always advising people, be it properties to invest in and or equities to invest in, to first invest in the great acceleration, then invest in the great acceleration delayed by human contact, like the examples that I gave you. And the third, which I've been speaking to now for a number of months, is the exact opposite. Everything that was destroyed, old school businesses coming back. And I think that as a result of the pandemic, what happened was so many businesses to survive cut their costs to the bare bones. And those that didn't disappeared. So the guys that survived had a lower cost of business structure than an excuse to terminate folks, cut overhead, expenses, et cetera, and at the same time have much less competition. And then come the politics side. As I often say in my business, one of the James Carville put a sign behind President Clinton's desk for giving him the formula to win re-election. And the sign was, "It's the economy, stupid," meaning focus on the economy and then everything else will follow. My sign was, now we've taken it down because they say it's not politically correct to be political, but my sign has been for the last 8 years, "It's the politics, stupid." And the importance of business focusing on the political dimensions, which is something that businessmen and CEO really didn't focus much on until more recently. And so if you looked at the political wins combined with the antidote, the vaccine, I think that this is going to be an incredible reopening. And old school businesses, everything from rides to airlines, to vacation destinations, to stores, you name it, all traditional businesses, an explosion. And that'll have ripple effects to other industries that, support them. Like one of the things I was talking about, I don't know if you heard me on one of the news channels, but was talking about oil prices and copper prices, timber, lumber as an example. All those things like oil and copper, et cetera, are things that are servicing industry. And so I see an explosive growth for those industries. And then certainly not least, beneficiary of inflation is real estate.
Thank you for that. That's a very detailed explanation. So I wanted to, as far as the explosive reopening that you're talking about, a huge part of this city was physical retail space. And, as you alluded to, the e-commerce, with the onset of the pandemic, e-commerce just absolutely took off. So where do you see how do you see physical retail space sort of pivoting to this new dynamic?
Okay, good question. The bad news is for landlords in New York that are the landlords that held us paid. We have to be lucky. Approximately 8 years ago, we started liquidating our portfolio. Not so much because of the political wins at first. It was more because of our concerns over e-commerce and our need to reinvest our dollars into the logistics business. And then later on, we accelerated because of our concern over New York City politics. As an example, Mayor de Blasio, who happens to be a friend of mine for decades, but to speak plainly, and I do speak plainly, his administration's policies were anti-business, and not as much just him. It wasn't just his fault. It was part of a whole political wave. I often say one of the greatest mistakes New York made, and it'll go down in history, was the political group that got together to stop Amazon from opening in New York City. Those 50,000 jobs, where we're close in to a lot of folks that were involved in the transaction, Amazon folks, et cetera. That 50,000 jobs was really planned to be more like 150,000 over time. And it was called 25, then called 50, but it was going to be mega. If you think of the ripple effects of all those jobs and businesses, from dry cleaners to dealerships, et cetera, that would have serviced, and if you think about who was going to be gainfully employed, mostly it was going to be workforce housing that was going to benefit from it. The big fancy jobs will still come. Amazon bought the Lord and Taylor building on Fifth Avenue and 39th Street, and they'll open that there. But it really is the sin was the workforce housing loss. So that's the bad news for New York. It started before the pandemic, and then obviously, I hate to say, got accelerated. So many things where New York couldn't get out of its own way. Now I'll tell you the positive side. That was the negative side and painful for the landlords. The positive side, and what excites me for New York, is the same thing. I think that we've seen a tremendous repricing here in New York. If you talk to any friends, find out what the real cost, including the free time, what it costs them to rent an apartment today as compared to a year ago. What does it cost to buy an apartment today? What does it cost to lease office space? And last, and certainly not least, in fact, the most, is actually retail rental rents. Rents are down 65%, call it. Truth be told, call it even the best areas, like take Fifth Avenue from 49th Street to 57th Street. I think rents, truth be told, are down 65 to 70% on that upper fifth part of New York. Nobody will talk about it. The statistics, I think, are foolers. But why is that good news? The good news is it gives New York a new opportunity. I think, whenever I'm talking or lecturing, I teach in different universities. And one of the things I say, people ask, where's the land of opportunity? Where should I live? And I tell them all the same thing. And I really mean it, even though it's somewhat self-serving. It's New York City. New York can be competitive again. It could have apartments that young folks can afford. So I think you're going to have a wave of young people coming into New York. Those apartments aren't going to sit empty. They're going to be full. It's just going to be charged a lower rate. And a lot of that migration that we see going to Florida, Texas, et cetera, I think is going to be, if people look back at the last 12 months versus the last 12 years, I think it's going to be a lot older crowd that migrated and somewhat even wealthier. And so first that, and then number two, in terms of retail real estate, that cheaper rent is going to create so much entrepreneurial opportunity for young people and young businesses to come and operate in New York City. And then last, and certainly not least, if you dig under the cover on the stimulus plan, which people don't, they just look at the headline, look at by city, all those programs and how disproportionately a city like New York is going to benefit. Like, let's say the billions that are going to cultural institutions and museums. Guess what? Where do you think the greatest density of those museums are? In New York. The density of them is, and the magnitude is tremendous. And so all those stimulus programs are going to way disproportionately favor New York. And secondly, I do believe that Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer, or as I call him now, President Schumer, I think that he gets the SALT tax deduction through. I think if he doesn't, AOC gets his job and he's no longer senator in New York in 2 years from today. That's my prediction. And I think that he's smart enough to know it and smart enough to get his vast power of his office behind it, which obviously will help New York, Chicago, California, etc.
Mm-hmm. So bold prediction. I guess we'll have to see if it comes through. So you sort of mentioned that, New York City and other urban areas, benefit from the density of population and sort of just like the natural sort of aggregation of resources in that way. So do you see many different trends happening in rural parts of the country or rural parts of other countries, I suppose?
Yeah. I'm still bullish on the rest of America. I think you can see a little bit of reversals, meaning that new super hip, cool restaurant for the last, I hate to say it to New York, was not opening in New York for the last 8 years. It was always opening in Austin and Charlotte and Nashville, et cetera, et cetera. I think you're going to see that coming back to New York. But middle America, I think, also gets a big wave of benefit. And where that benefit's going to come from is onshore. Again, back to my original comment in terms of what one of the things that make us or myself a little bit different than most folks or CEOs, I'm always paying attention to the politics. And the politics is not just local New York City, and it's not even USA and federal. It's global geopolitical. And the biggest geopolitical politic, which I've been talking about for many years, is, as I've predicted for many, many years, is the Cold War with China. It's here, baby. Back then, I used to talk about it like it was something from the moon. I often would get on and say, guys, it's a 3-step game to start with some side tangents. It's conquer Hong Kong, conquer Taiwan, and eventually, long-term down the road, conquer Australia. And a little side game using belt and suspenders economic plan to be able to have influence in Africa and Latin America, the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a result of it, what I was saying would happen is now starting to happen, which is really onshoring. If you're going to get a growing geopolitical divide or Cold War between the United States and China, a lot of the world is going to have to pick a side and fall within one of those two spheres. And one of the ramifications on it here locally is going to be onshoring. There are so many things that have ruled the world in prior years. It could be oil, the past, and then I can go through ports and ships going back a couple of hundred years, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things amongst other things I'll use as an example is chip technology. We're getting a taste of it just with the shortage that's going on now. The issue is not just being caught short-handed, it's also the level of technology and what it means to the world. And first, in terms of the shortage, I think back to a year ago, reading an article, how Jared Kushner, who happens to be a friend, was turned to by the then President Trump. And President Trump told them, you know what, this thing's coming. We got to use the U.S. government's right, just like we do for military stuff in a war. We have to take over, nationalize any plant that makes I-95 masks or the key plants that make vaccines. And he comes back to his father-in-law and says, we can. So why not? He says, because none of it's made in America. Where's it made? It's made in China. So he can't even nationalize it. And so that was a hard lesson that America learned. And so there's going to be so much of a focus on onshoring. And that's going to be beneficial to middle America in so many dynamics and so many different ways. And so that's why I see great opportunity in addition to the other things I talked about, let's say for New York, where I said it's stimulus meets vaccine meets spring, middle America, it's stimulus meets vaccine meets onshoring. And I think there's going to be so many jobs brought here. And again, back to the example, it's one of the many I can give you, but I'll give you one company in the chip business called ASML. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. It's a $250 billion company. It's based in the Netherlands. And the United States has a deal with the president of that country to not allow those chips to be exported to the United States. Eventually, the new president there is going to break and he's going to want to sell them. Why is America so worried about it? The technology is so advanced. It uses photographic technology to put the materials onto the chips, so to speak. And it's so advanced that if China was to put the military or listening devices on it, there's no way America could even track what has it and what does it, because the photo technology in terms of how it's being manufactured. So you will see just one of many industries, an explosion of chip manufacturing happening right here in the good old US of A. And I can go industry by industry. So needless to say, I'm bullish on America as a result of all these different dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be very important for, keeping the income disparity down between like the urban and rural populations in America. So yeah, it's a great point. We've been talking a lot about the sort of the industry in the US. I know that Thor Equities is pretty heavily involved in some European countries. So which international cities are you particularly bullish on these days?
Okay. Now we're active in a lot of different ways, not just real estate, many different markets. If I had to say, and again, it moves from time to time, like China. I'm excited for China, but China for China because of the sphere thing that I spoke about. So, but that's something common that you kind of expect. I'd say the biggest curveball I'd say today is the country of Israel. Country of Israel. I don't think, one of the things we were talking about before we started this program, we're talking about technology industries and the growth of technology in New York City and what a different thing it is and a phenomenon that's going to affect New York. I think that times 10 is what technology industry is doing for Israel. I don't know if you saw it this week, but Blackstone announced they're opening an office in Israel to invest in technology businesses there. It's an absolute explosion of ventures, tech ventures coming out of Israel. Per capita, I would say it blows away San Francisco and Silicon Valley in terms of the amount of new business, new tech, new funding, et cetera, et cetera. It's a land of opportunity. And because they were disconnected a lot from big parts of the world because of a lot of the local politics, which has now come undone as a result of the peace treaty that Israel's done with so many of the Gulf nations, Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Oman, et cetera, and the relationships they have with the Saudis. That sort of opened the door. In fact, I don't know if you saw this week, but a humongous investment by the UAE inside of Israel. And going back the other way, so much investment by Israel in various Arab countries. And so that sort of is the final icing on the cake to open the doors for them. And so that's going to allow capital markets, a company like Blackstone and others, to come into that country, and they'll be backing ventures left and right. It's going to be mind-boggling. People don't realize how much has come from there, like Waze that guides our cars. But in the past, companies like Waze had to sell early to companies like Google because they didn't have a capital markets confidence behind them to ride with them into IPOs. So that'll be a new explosion. And it's not just typical technologies, it's EV as well in a big way. one of the technologies I saw that fascinates me, and I invested in it through a public company. It's called Electrion. And what they're doing is they're actually electrifying the highways underneath the asphalt. And they do dynamic, which is moving car, and then they do static, which means that if you're a truck pulled up to an Amazon warehouse and you're waiting for shipment of the goods, that truck could be recharged from underneath the asphalt. So static recharging. It's fascinating. It's called Electrion. And there's so many companies like that. And I don't know if you know the name Kathy Wood, ARC, but she's the new hot gal on the scene. Take a look at where her growth money, her new venture is. You know, she attacked ingenuity and engineering, genome. What's her fourth concept? Just the country of Israel technology in all food groups. And so I would say Israel is absolutely fascinating what's going on. Land of entrepreneurship.
That's an interesting insight. It's interesting you mentioned the electrified roads. I think that could really be a game changer for the logistics space. You know, it's already blowing up so much within the last mile delivery space, but then if you had that component to it, then it could become even bigger in that sense.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. So the last question that I wanted to ask before we jump into some audience questions, we've been talking a lot about the future of New York City and the future of New York City real estate. So we just want to hear, is there anything in particular that you're very excited about, a project that's upcoming in the city? And I kind of an addendum to that, actually, I saw that Thor is actually creating a life science space in Jersey City. So I wanted to know your thoughts on how these sort of peripheral cities around, the 5 boroughs will play a role in this sort of explosive reopening of the city.
Okay, 3 parts my answer. Number one, we sort of left New York City, or started to about 8 years ago, selling almost everything we could to move to the West Coast, to move to Austin, to move to Nashville, Carolinas, Florida, other Europe, et cetera, et cetera. Macro comment, I'm now bullish on New York. I know nobody else seems to be that I talk to, but we at Thor tend to normally run the other way of others. While it works well for us, the one challenge is we're institutional money managers. We take care of and invest the capital for institutions, endowments, pension funds, and high net worth individuals. So the catch-22 with our overall philosophy is we're always going in the opposite direction of everybody else. So it's sometimes a little hard to get our institutional and high net worth investors to get what we're doing and follow along with it. But we like New York. We like New York from individual opportunities and even from public markets perspectives. As an example, again, I'll give you one public market one called that we own a position. It's called Alexander's, ALX. 85% of their investment is just one building. It's the Bloomberg Tower on, I think it's 59th and Lex and 3rd. And undervalued, beat up, trades for probably, if you sell off the other components, close to an 8 cap, got a good dividend, 6.5, and nobody wants to own it. Why? People have given up on New York. I believe in New York. So that's general comment. Second thing, in terms of projects I'm excited about in New York, we do have one as part of our re-entry in New York. We just launched 2 days ago a hotel. It's called Modern House. It's on Thompson and Grand, some of the bones we inherited from an acquisition, something called the Chains. It's about 10 blocks or so from NYU's campus on Thompson and Grand. It's a fabulous hotel. We bought it from somebody who had gone into some economic issues. It's a Bauhaus, modernist, concrete and glass building structure, and we built it lifestyle. We believe and believe that sort of, as I was telling you, when so many of the wise men were saying the end of the world was coming a year ago, we believed the opposite. We believed that when the pandemic lifts, it's sort of like, the cabin fever and spring fever we get, that only comes from a few short months. This is going to come from almost a year and a half. And so as a result, we're expecting an absolute explosion in F&B demand. And so we built it with 4 venues, one outdoor area there that's sort of like Chateau Marmont's place in LA. We built another restaurant there called Veranda with a Michelin star chef, where you could, we catered to the post-pandemic world. The way we built it, the entire thing is a pergola and glass cube. So you can push a button and you can open any wall or any ceiling to the outside in case we need to be pandemic friendly, which works well in the warm weather. And then we have another venue. It's called Jumpin' Jacks. We built a whole floor that's a coffee house half the day, and then cocktails by night, and then a roof party place on the top called the Jimmy. So that's in New York, exciting project. And then the answer to your third question in terms of project in the New York area that you talked about was our lab. We purchased 2 projects, about 2 million square feet in the recent past in the state of New Jersey. That's in the laboratory business. We bought something called Center of Excellence in North Jersey to redevelop the lab, and obviously it's done well for us. And then more recently, we purchased a 350,000 square foot building in Jersey City to build laboratory space totally on spec. It's a very gutsy move, but we feel like we know the space. We know what we're doing. Labs is a funny business, sort of like logistics. It's not for amateurs. I watch so many people enter the lab or logistics space and just lose money and come to us to pick up the pieces. Both of them have their own idiosyncrasies, but it's an exciting project. And we believe in Jersey City. We think Jersey City will be a post-COVID acceleration winner.
Great. Yeah, that sounds good. I can't wait to visit that hotel. So we're going to go to some questions from the audience now. So the first one is, if you could go back and give your younger self some advice about starting out in real estate in New York City, what would that be?
Is that about a particular industry or in general?
In real estate.
Okay. Well, the truth is, now I thought about it, the answer is the same. It's open your eyes. I look around. I often say, including myself, we're so addicted to these telephones. We don't look up. We don't know what's going on. You know, you got to wake up and smell the roses. But I would start with wake up, look up, and just see the roses and see the opportunities. Opportunities are everywhere. So I would drive around New York City, drive around, look into any industry, and look for opportunity. In terms of New York, I see opportunity everywhere. You know, like I said, I'm the exact opposite of probably 90% of the people that I think are the most intelligent and that I respect the most. 90% of the people, you sit across from them in almost every asset class, and they still, it's sort of like Warren Buffett and Sam Zell and Bill Gates 1 year ago about the world is New York City real estate developers about New York today. The world's coming to an end. New York's over. It's never coming back. It's terrible. I see opportunity candidly everywhere. Multifamily. I think people are going to come back into New York. Office. I think that technology businesses, that base that they got in Hudson Yards, and then go further south into Hudson, all of that base that created that foothold, and now cheaper offerings of space, going to create an explosion of growth. For the first time in a long time, New York can compete with Austin, Texas, and the Carolinas, et cetera, on price. And so it's everything. Retail, again, you hear me now? I'm bullish. Now, it may take a little time for prices to adjust down to fair versus the rents that you can get. But okay, 6 months, a year and a half from today, opportunity will come.
That's great advice. Thank you. Next question is, what are 1 or 2 key steps that the next mayor of New York City should do to help foster sort of real estate and real estate development in the city?
I think it's not so much for real estate. Real estate's a service industry, so it relies on the success of business. So there's nothing that they need to do for the real estate industry. It's what they need to do for New Yorkers. And they need to have two focuses in my mind. Number one, they have to care about people in terms of how they make a living. The best example was, and forgive me if I'm sounding political. I don't mean to be. I'm a political independent. I registered at the Arts and Sciences at NYU in the hallway for my first political, and I haven't changed it, political independent. But speaking plainly, what AOC did to New York, it's terrible. Like I said, the only people that suffered, or the people that suffered most, was her own personal constituency. It was the people at the lowest, amongst the lowest rung on that income ladder, and then up to the medium workforce housing. So first thing is, we need a mayor that doesn't think of themselves as the enemy of business, but thinks of themselves as the ambassador of the city, and makes one of their top priority getting workforce housing jobs. Not the fancy jobs. The fancy jobs will come anyway, but caring about the middle income folks, and caring if businesses come here to gainfully employ, not trying to scare them away as an ambassador. And then number two is just rule of law and safety. Those companies that create the jobs are going to want to come to amongst the different dynamics. And by the way, just so you know, what I tell us, I'm close to Bill de Blasio and his number two call. So I tell it to him. I have a blizzard of text messages, over the pandemic, et cetera, saying this. So this is not behind anybody's back. It's just getting people comfortable. There's rule of law. I can't tell you how many people I know that abandoned New York and moved to other cities just because, finally crime was the icing on the cake at all income levels, all races. And that's a really, really important thing. And what's crazy, we got to remember, and I often tell the mayor, is that, okay, who cares? The people that leave, you often hear being said by politicians, but they don't realize the rest of us, the ones that stay loyal to New York, we're the ones that are going to suffer because our property tax bills are going to go up, as we recently saw. Income tax bills are going up. It's going up because the other people abandoned us and said, screw them, who needs it? So we got to remember, we need, as an administration, the mayor's office has to want to be loyal to those people that stay in New York and not abandon New York.
Okay, thank you. Those are good points for sure. Next question. So you talked about business that depend on communality. So what are your thoughts on share space real estate companies like WeWork?
WeWork is a story all by itself. I will say, I'm not embarrassed to say, most people will he was a movie star, Adam Newman. 99.999% of the people that were his friends in the business world deny they were his friend. They deny ever meeting him. I don't. I will tell you, in the earliest day, I was his advisor. I was his go-to guy. I was a little bit of a mentor for him. I'm talking very earliest days. No, I'm not part of the movie, thankfully. And I will tell you that their rails came off for a lot of different reasons. It was a lack of focus, an aggressiveness in terms of rents they paid, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, the business model, I believe in. I forget WeWork. We'll talk co-working. I bet you right now that's a curse word in the real estate business. If you asked anybody else other than me in the real estate industry, any landlord, almost every single landlord, I'd say probably 10 out of 10 would say co-working is a disaster. It's over. It's done. It's finished. Thank God we got rid of it. I think they're going to be blown away, not in 2 years from today, not in 1 year from today. I say in 6 months from today. I think it's going to fill up with so much entrepreneurial tendencies so quickly that you'll have them before the end of this year, almost full in terms of their space offerings, all of those folks in that business. So I don't give up on it. I'm still bullish.
That would be quite the feat because they own quite a few million square feet in the city. So that would be quite the feat. So probably the last question we have for tonight is a relevant one for us. Would you ever consider teaching a class at Stern, and what would it be?
I used to teach. Professor Angel used to allow me within because we didn't have an entrepreneurship class at NYU. So I used to come multiple times through a semester. I used to teach an entrepreneurship class. I also worked with Professor Fisher, the Fisher brothers, the mega wealthy owners here in New York City. He was a professor in the graduate school. I was his regular lecturer on real estate and real estate entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial opportunities within real estate. We covered development, et cetera, et cetera. So I've done in the past. I haven't done it in a lot of years. I did it for probably around 13 years straight for one professor. And then for the other professor, I probably did it for about 5 years. And I will tell you, sad to say, both was great. If they invited me back, I probably would come back. I will tell you, God rest their souls, both those NYU professors have passed on. But both great people with NYU in their blood.
Yeah. So do you have a class that you would want to teach there? Maybe something around entrepreneurship, I assume.
Yeah, probably something a little bit more entrepreneurial focused.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, maybe then someday that can become a reality. Well, this has been really, really insightful conversation. So thank you so much on behalf of NYU and Stern for your time today. It's a really pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone who joined us virtually. We thank you for, staying engaged in the alumni community, and we look forward to the day when we can all do this again in person, hopefully someday soon. But until then, everyone take care, stay safe, and have a wonderful evening.